The recycled air aboard the Cairn Margot smelled like iron and old sweat and the specific loneliness of a man who had been alone too long. Dek Orvan had stopped noticing it somewhere around the 4th month. He noticed it again now, standing in the narrow corridor between the cargo bays, with a pressure wrench in his hand and nothing particular to fix. And he thought, this is what I have become, a man who smells like his own ship and cannot tell the difference. He went aft anyway. There were always valves. Cairn Margot was a Del Guard-class bulk hauler, built for ore transit between the Kesson Belt and the inner processing stations, and it had not carried ore in 11 months. It had not carried anything in 11 months except Dek Orvan, technically crew, and technically its captain, and technically the only registered human aboard. According to the transponder that was also technically off, the ship ran dark, no beacon, no radio traffic, no heat signature beyond the minimum the life support system required to keep one man breathing. Out here, in the rubble shadow of the Halvan Drift, the hegemony scan sweeps passed over a cold smear of rock and saw nothing. That was the point. Dek had supply runner for the compact fleet when the war started. He had been very good at it. He knew the routes between staging depots the way other men knew the routes between rooms in their childhood homes. By the quality of the dark, by instinct, by the memory of turns made 10,000 times before, when the hegemony pushed past the quarter line and the depots became targets, and the staging routes became kill corridors, Dek kept running. When the fleet told him to stop, he kept running. And the fleet stepped, being able to tell him anything, because the relay stations were gone. He kept running until he had nothing left to deliver and nowhere to deliver it to, and then he parked in the Halvan Drift and became very quiet. He had been meaning to record a distress log. The fleet had protocols for isolated personnel, and the protocols said a distress log had to be recorded every 30 days and synced to the emergency beacon archive. And the emergency beacon archive was the thing that would, in theory, let someone find you if you were lost. Dek had not recorded one in 4 months. He was not entirely sure he wanted to be found, but he set up the camera anyway in the forward mess, because the light was better there, and because the protocol said chest-height framing, and because it was something to do on a Tuesday. He arranged himself in front of the lens and looked at it for a while. Cairn Margot, he said. Regidri DMH 7741, day 312. Paused. I am the only one aboard. I am fine. The ship is operational. I am running low on the good coffee, and the secondary water recycler is making a noise it wasn't making before. A sort of clicking, but it's probably nothing. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who fixed things constantly and badly. Knuckles like gnarled wood. A scar across the left palm from a cable housing he'd caught wrong in year 2 of his first contract. I am fine, he said again, because the protocol called for a wellness report. He reached forward and stopped the recording. He played it back that evening, eating a reconstituted rice packet and watching himself say he was fine. He watched the way he sat, very still, very straight, like a man trying to convince a room that he was comfortable in it. His mother had used to say he sat like he was waiting for permission to leave. He watched his own face and felt the peculiar sadness of recognizing something true about yourself from the outside, through a recording, in a mess hall on a ship in the middle of nothing. Then he saw the shadow behind the vent cover. He stopped the playback, went back. A vent cover in the rear of the mess. The one behind his left shoulder in the frame had a slat missing. He had never repaired it because it didn't matter, because no one was ever in the mess except him. Behind the missing slat, in the darkness of the duct beyond, there was a shape that was not duct. He sat with his rice packet and looked at it for a long time. Then he put the rice down and got the lamp from the emergency locker and went to the vent. He did not know what he expected. He did not let himself think too hard about what he expected, because thinking about it would require deciding how afraid he was, and he had not decided yet. The lamp beam went through the missing slat and found the darkness inside, and found, inside the darkness, 2 sets of eyes. They were amber, the color of the shallow water around the reef atolls he had seen once as a child, on a world he could no longer remember the name of. They caught the light and held it the way water holds light, deep and still. Below the first set of eyes, larger, adult, set wide in a face that was not a human face, a smaller set, narrower, blinking slowly in the sudden brightness. Dek Orvan had spent 3 years running supply through contested space. He had been boarded twice by hegemony pickets and had talked his way out both times by being aggressively unremarkable. He knew what hegemony Keth looked like up close. The 4-jointed limbs, the tessellated scaling down the neck and shoulders, the wide-set amber eyes that could track heat independently of visible light. He knew what they smelled like, too. Like copper and something organic he had never been able to name. The Cairn Margot smelled like iron and old sweat and copper. He had not noticed. "Right," he said to the vent cover, in a voice that he worked to make level. "Right." He stood up. He went to the cargo bay control panel. His hand found the environmental management system and scrolled to section purge, and his thumb hovered over the confirmation for bay access corridor 3, which connected to the duct system, which connected to the forward mess vent. 1 press. Pressure would equalize to vacuum in 90 seconds. It was the protocol. It was what you did. His thumb did not press. He stood there with his thumb over the button for long enough that the panel's idle screen came on, and he had to touch it to wake it up again. He looked at the confirmation screen. Purge duct section C3 forward, confirm YNA. He thought about the smaller set of eyes, the slow blink. He had seen that blink before, in cargo runs before the war, when he had occasionally carried livestock. A reflex, that blink, not of alarm but of assessment, the ancient animal movement that meant, "I see you. Do you see me? Are we safe?" He pressed N. He went back to the vent, crouched down, which hurt his knees in the way his knees now always hurt, and he put his mouth close to the slat and he said, in the pigeon trade lingua, that every species with a presence in the belt spoke to some degree. "I know you're there. I am not going to vent the section. But I need you to come out." Silence, for long enough that he began to wonder if he had hallucinated it. Then a sound from inside the duct, a soft, clicking chittering that he recognized as Keth vocalization, too low and fast for him to pass. A pause. Then the vent cover moved, and they came out. The female was tall for Keth, which meant she was tall for almost anything, and she had been in the duct long enough that one of the scaling plates on her left shoulder was discolored, a dry grey-white against the deep bronze of the rest. Malnutrition or dehydration or both. She held the juvenile behind her with one lower arm. Keth had 4 too high set for manipulation, 2 low set for carrying and climbing, and kept her eyes on deck with the absolute focused stillness of something that has been hunted and knows it. The juvenile was very small. Its amber eyes were enormous in proportion to its face. It was wearing, Dek noticed, a piece of insulation foam from the duct wall, wrapped around it like a blanket, held in place by strips of what appeared to be wire from a conduit splice. They had been in the ducts for weeks. They had made a blanket. "Okay," Dek said. He thought about the fleet. He thought about the war. He thought about the fact that the species currently in his forward mess vent were the same species that had pushed past the Corda line and destroyed the relay stations and turned the supply routes into kill corridors. He thought about what happened to humans who sheltered hegemony nationals. "Okay," he said again, and went to the galley and opened the emergency ration cabinet and hooks out 2 packs. He put them on the floor. Then he went to his bunk and lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and tried to decide what he had just done. What he had just done, turned out, was acquire a household. He did not think of it in those terms immediately. Immediately he thought of it in terms of threat assessment and resource depletion and the legal exposure of a compact fleet contractor harboring hegemony nationals in contested space, which under the Compact War statutes was approximately 9 levels of illegal, and carried a penalty he did not look up because he suspected looking it up would make him feel sick. But the law was a theoretical framework that existed somewhere beyond the Halvan Drift, and in the Halvan Drift, there were only 3 beings, one of them small and wrapped in insulation foam, and the law had not seemed particularly interested in any of them for the past 11 months. The female, he came to think of her as Meets, not because that was her name, which he could not pronounce, but because she made a sound in the back of her throat that approximated it when she was trying to get his attention, kept to the aft cargo bay at first. She was methodical. She assessed the space with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to making do. Within 2 days, she had organized his haphazardly stacked supply crates into a structure that was unmistakably a room. Not just storage. A room. Corners defined by stacked crates, a floor section cleared, and lined with the packing insulation she had apparently been harvesting from everywhere. On the ship she could reach without his noticing. The juvenile, Sao, he decided, again phonetic approximation, did not keep to anything. Sao moved through the Cairn Margot with the specific fearlessness of small creatures who have not yet fully learned what fear is for. Deck would find him in the engine access tunnel, examining the coolant manifold. In the forward observation blister, pressed flat against the viewport, amber eyes wide. In the mess, sitting directly across the table from Deck's usual seat, waiting. "You can't sit there," Deck said the 3rd time. Sao sat there. Deck ate his breakfast standing at the counter. By the end of the 2nd week, he was sitting across from Sao at the table. He did not think about how this had happened. It had happened the way most things happened on the Cairn Margot. Gradually, through inertia, through the repetition of small acts, until the acts became routine and the routine became the shape of a day. Meets watched him with the amber patience of something that is taking very careful measurements. He could not read Keth facial expressions well. They were not designed for the same muscles, did not move in the same registers, but he had been around enough non-human species to know that stillness was not absence. She was thinking. She was always thinking. He began to feel that she was composing something, building some kind of internal record, but he had no way to ask and no way for her to explain. He taught Sao to play a card game. Not a real card game. He didn't have cards, but a version of it with labels peeled off ration packs. Each one assigned a number he wrote on the back with a stylus. Sao could not hold the cards the way a human hand held cards. Keth's lower arms had tremendous fine motor control, and Sao adapted. He began to cheat approximately on day 3 in ways that were barely detectable, which Deck found privately impressive. "You're cheating," Deck said. Sao's upper face shifted in a way Deck had come to associate with satisfaction. "Yeah," Deck said, "I know." Clicking noise in the secondary water recycler got worse. Deck took the housing off on a Tuesday and found the impeller bearing had cracked, and he was sitting on the floor of the utility bay with the components spread around him when Mitz appeared in the doorway. She studied the layout of the parts for a moment. Then she pointed at 2 of them, a gesture with her upper right arm, precise and deliberate, and then pointed at each other. He looked at where she was pointing. Crack bearing and the coupling from the purge valve assembly, which he had removed 2 months ago when the purge valve started sticking and had not reinstalled because the purge valve worked fine without it. The coupling was not the right shape. But Mitz moved her hands in a short, particular way, and he picked up the parts and held them together, and he could see what she was seeing. If you machined a notch in the coupling, press fit against the bearing housing and hold the cracked halves in alignment. Not a real repair, a kludge. A piece of wire holding something together. He machined the notch. It worked. He did not say thank you, because he did not know how to say thank you in Keth, and he had an instinct that she would not have wanted it anyway. That thanks was not the currency she was operating in. He went back to the mess and set the table for 3 for the first time, a 3rd ration pack on the floor at the height Sao preferred, and he thought about the bearing coupling and what it meant to look at broken things and see how they could hold. The Hegemony warship arrived on a Thursday. It came out of the drift at the edge of scan range, slow and deliberate, a Reclaimer class, 2 gun decks, crew of 200, The kind of ship designed to comb through wreckage and find what was worth salvaging, including, Dek did not doubt people, including Keth nationals who had gone missing in compact controlled space. The Cairn Margot was running dark, but a reclaimer class carried dedicated passive optical arrays, and the drift was not infinite. If they were sweeping in a grid pattern, find him in 18 hours or less. He sat at the navigation console and watched the ship's position update on the passive tracker. Because he was running dark, but he was still listening, and he thought about 18 hours and what he was going to do with them. Behind him, Meets stood in the entrance to the bridge. He had not heard her come up the corridor. He had not heard her for weeks, he realized. She moved with a care and delicacy that had initially seemed like caution, but had shifted into something else, something that felt like courtesy. Turned around. She was looking at the display, at the reclaimer class silhouette. And her face did something he had not seen it do in 3 weeks of observation. It went still in a different way. Not the stillness of assessment, the stillness of recognition, of something known. She spoke. It was the longest sequence of Keth vocalization she had produced since they'd come out of the vent, and he could not pass most of it, but he caught the trade lingua fragments woven in. All Keth used trade lingua fragments now, 11 months into the war, because it was the only shared substrate, and what he caught was something like, found us returning, the record must be. She stopped. She looked at him. He did not know what she was asking. He did not know if she was asking anything. He turned back to the display and watched the reclaimer class hold its heading and thought about 18 hours and the legal framework that existed beyond the Halvan Drift and the 9 levels of illegal that he had been for 22 days now. "I'm not turning you in," he said. He was not sure why he said it. He was not sure it was the right thing to say or even what it would mean to her. But she made a sound he had not heard before. Not the clicking vocalization, not the trade lingua fragments, but something lower and longer, somewhere between a tone and a resonance, and the hair on his arm stood up. Sao appeared from the corridor behind her and pressed against her lower arm and made the same sound, quieter, like an echo. Programmed a microburn. 12 seconds, just enough to angle them deeper into the drift, trading their angle of approach against the reclaimer's sweep radius. Not hiding, there was nowhere to hide, not really, but buying time. What you did when there was no good option was keep wood moving and see what the time produced. What the time produced was the reclaimer changing course. They tracked it for 4 hours. The warship moved through the drift in a pattern that was clearly search-based, covering ground, and then, in a way that Dek could not immediately explain, the pattern changed. The reclaimer began to move toward him, not in the oblique approach of a ship that had detected a contact, but in the direct approach of a ship that already knew where it was going. "They found us," he said. Mitt said something. He caught on one word clearly. "Chose." He looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she crossed the bridge, all 4 limbs moving with that liquid efficiency he had stopped registering as alien 3 weeks ago, and she put her upper right hand on the communications console. It was a question. He could see it was a question in the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the particular angle of her amber eyes. "This is your ship, this is your call, but I am telling you that there is a way through." "You want me to hail them," he said. She waited. "On my ship," he said. Broadcasting openly, in the middle of a war. She waited. Dek Orvan thought about the pressure wrench and the valves he fixed, and the card game with the peeled ration pack labels and the recycler bearing, and the 3 ration packs on the table, the 3rd one on the floor. He thought about the dating service video he had never sent to anyone. The one where he looked like a man waiting for permission to leave a room he had been alone in for too long. He reached past her hand and opened the channel. "Cairn Margot to Hegemony Vessel. This is Dek Orvan, Compact Fleet Registry, DMH7741. I have 2 Keth nationals aboard. 1 adult female, 1 juvenile. They are in good health. I am prepared for boarding at your discretion." Static for 11 seconds. He counted. Then a voice, flat, mechanical, the translation that they all used, said, "Cairn Margot, hold position." Boarding team en route. He held position. The boarding team was 8 Keth soldiers in carrier weave and 4 more who hung back near the airlock crew, armed but not leveled. The team leader walked through the Cairn Margot with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this many times and expected it to take a few minutes. Dek stood in the cargo bay with his hands at his sides, watched them move through his ship and registered that it was still his ship, that somehow the 3 weeks had not changed that. The ship was still his, and it also smelled like copper and old sweat and iron, and he thought, right. Mitz stood beside him. Sao was behind her, one small hand gripping her lower arm. The team leader stopped in front of them. The translator unit, a flat disc at his collar, rendered his vocalization into something approximate. You have been in contact with Hegemony Nationals for how long? 22 days. You did not report. No. The team leader looked at him the way Mitz had looked at him in the mess, the first night, the slow amber assessment. Then he looked at Mitz, and there was a long exchange of vocalization that Dek could not follow. Too dense and idiomatic for his trade lingua fragments to catch. It went on for 2 minutes, then 3. Sao, he noticed, had moved from behind Mitz to standing beside Dek, its small frame against Dek's leg, looking up at the team leader with the same focused absence of fear it had applied to the coolant manifold. Dek did not look down. He kept his eyes on the team leader and waited. The exchange stopped. The team leader looked at Dek for a long time. Then the translator said, "She is a remembrancer." Dek did not know the word in the military sense, which turned out to be different from the general sense. In the general trade lingua sense, a remembrancer was a record keeper, a historian, someone whose biological architecture made them what Keth called a living witness. Someone whose memories were not merely stored but encoded in a format that could be read by hegemony biochemical interface upon death and preserved intact, carried into the collective record of the species. Every significant Keth community had them. They were not soldiers. They were the people who made sure that what happened was not forgotten. She had been on a colony ship. The colony ship had been caught in the opening hours of the push past the Corda line and destroyed, and she and Sao had survived in a sealed emergency pod that had drifted for 6 weeks until it had found, electromagnetically, the nearest large metal object in the drift, which was the Cairn Margot. They had boarded while Dek was asleep, which he found, retroactively, impressive and slightly alarming. They had not announced themselves because they did not know what a human would do, and they had been running from humans for 6 weeks, and Mitz had decided that watching first was safer than asking. She had watched. She had decided what she saw. What a remembrancer encoded was not just events, it was texture, meaning. The small acts that revealed what a species was when no one was performing for anyone. The card game with the ration pack labels. Bearing coupling. The third bowl on the floor, the hand that hovered over the purge confirmation and pressed N. The record she carries, the team leader said, is the first-hand remembrancer account of extended contact with a human that does not derive from combat or interrogation. It is the first account in which a human, he paused, there was a clicking exchange with one of the other soldiers, is recorded as choosing without duress when choice was available. Dex said nothing. The conclave has been reviewing the terms of the conflict, the team leader said, and the translator's flat rendering could not entirely strip the weight from it. There are factions that argue the compact is categorically incapable of. Another clicking pause. Restraint. That the encounter patterns suggest a species that does not recognize restraint as a survival value. The record she carries is evidence in that debate. "I'm one man," Dex said, "on one ship, yes. I hid in a rock field for 11 months and fed your people the same food I eat. That's not a policy position." "No," the team leader said. "It is better than a policy position." The amber eyes held Dek's gaze. Policy can be argued. What she carries cannot be argued. It is what it is. Is what you were, alone, with no one watching. Dek thought about the camera. The distress log. He was fine. The ship was operational. He was running low on the good coffee. He had been alone for so long he had forgotten that alone was not the same as unwatched. He had been watched. He had been seen. He had pressed N. What happens now, he said. The team leader looked at Mitz. She made the long resonant sound, the one that raised the hair on Deck's arms, and this time the soldiers heard it, and several of them made the sound back, quiet and reflexive, the way you echo something true before you've decided to. Now, the team leader said, she delivers her record to the conclave, and the conclave decides. But something moved in the amber eyes. The translator could not render it. Deck had spent 3 weeks reading what amber eyes did and did not carry. The weight of what she carries is significant. A remembrancer's account carries more than any number of political communiques. It carries what is. And what she witnessed on this ship for 22 days is, he paused. The translator clicked, is evidence of something the hegemony had not previously been able to confirm about. Species. What's that? Deck said. The amber eyes were steady. That you can be lonely, the team leader said, and choose anyway to make room. Took Mitz and Sao aboard the reclaimer. Deck stood at the airlock and watched the boarding tube retract and thought about 22 days. And the shape a household makes when it forms around you, without your noticing, the way routines accumulate until they are load-bearing, the way you set a third bowl on the floor and do not register what you have done until much later. Sao had stopped at the airlock. He had looked up at Deck with the enormous amber eyes and reached out with one small lower arm hand and gripped Deck's wrist. Not hard. Grip of something small that has learned you are safe and needs you to know it knows it. Then he let go and followed Mitz into the tube. The reclaimer pulled away from the drift, on a heading that would take it deep into hegemony space, toward the conclave, toward whatever Remembrance's testimony did to the calculations of a war. Deck watched it go on the passive tracker for 3 hours and then made himself look away. He went to the mess. He sat at the table. Across from him, the other seat was empty. He looked at it for a while. Then he reached forward and turned on the camera. Cairn Margot, he said. Reshidri DMH 7741. Day 334. He looked at his hands, then at the lens. I'm fine, he said. The ship is... He stopped. He thought about what the ship was. The ship is different, he said. I fixed the water recycler. There's a clicking noise it wasn't making before, but it's probably nothing. It's... He looked toward the airlock corridor. Habit, the way you look toward the sound of someone moving through your ship. Nothing. I am alone, he said. But I don't think, he thought about the Remembrancer, about what she had carried out of his ship and into the conclave's calculations, about what one man on one ship in a rock field could, apparently, mean if he pressed N at the right moment and set a bowl on the floor. I don't think it'll stay that way, he said. He stopped the recording. He made coffee, the last of the good kind, the kind he had been hoarding, and he sat at the table and drank it while it was still hot, which was something he had not done in months. And he listened to the Cairn Margot move through the dark. In the duct behind the mess, the slat was still missing. Through it, the duct was empty, but the wire was still there, the stripped wire from the conduit splice that Sao had, used to hold the insulation blanket together. And it caught the light the way amber eyes caught light, small and steady and present. Deck finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup. He put it back in the cabinet, and then he stood at the cabinet for a moment. Then he took out 2 more cups and set them on the counter, handles turned out. Just in case.